Yo guys, welcome back to a brand new video. Today, we're going to go ahead and dive into the Season 28 Horde of the 90 Savages Frenzy Barbarian. Now, one thing I will note right before we dive in is that this is going to be for the speed version. If you're looking for the pushing version or the RGK variant, you may want to look up a guide on Maxroll because I don't think I'm going to be covering them. First off, let's dive into the skills and passives. We're going to take Frenzy with Berserk because we are going to be stacking cold damage % on this character. One thing to note though is that the belt that we're using is going to give us the effect of every rune for Frenzy. Next up, we're going to be using Battle Rage just to gain some additional crit hit chance and deal some more damage. We're also going to be using Furious Charge with Cold Rush. This skill is phenomenal, and it's going to add so much damage to our character. If we look at the Horde of 90 Savages set, we can see that the 2-piece bonus says double the effectiveness of shouts, and you deal double damage to feared, frozen, or stunned enemies. Furious Charge is how we're going to be freezing them, and it lasts for a whole 2.5 seconds, which is really nice. Next up, we're going to be using Threatening Shout with Falter. This is great in both solo and group play because enemies are going to take more damage from all sources. We'll also be using Warcry, and this is really nice for the build because we are going to be using a Squirt's Necklace, and it gives us that increased dodge chance. But in addition to that, we also gain increased armor. This is also great for solo and group play, which is really nice because I feel like this build's primary purpose is going to be RGK. But of course, it is the Hadrig's Gift set this season, and so I wanted to create a build on the speedrun aspect. And lastly, for the skills, we've got Wrath of the Berserker with Insanity. This is going to give us crit hit chance, attack speed, dodge chance, and movement speed. We also just gain an additional 50% increased damage. You can keep this up 100% of the time as long as you have a decent Greater Rift where there are a lot of elites that you can get to quickly. This is because we will be using Ingeom in the build, and so we're mostly going to be elite hunting. Now to get into the passives, we're going to start with Rampage. This is really good, especially for speed runs when we can quickly kill enemies and get this stacked up 25 times. Moving on to Berserker Rage, this is a pretty easy choice for this build because we are using a generator of Frenzy as our primary damage source, and so we're always going to be at maximum fury or really close. Next up, you'll want to take Boon of Bolkathos. This is only here to reduce the cooldown on Wrath of the Berserker. And lastly, we'll take Brawler. This build does kind of struggle a little bit with large packs, and so it's nice to have Brawler to kind of assist with that. We'll get into why it struggles with large packs later in the video. Moving on to the gear, we're going to be using our set helm. You are going to want strength, vitality, or all resistance and crit hit chance, as well as a socket. Go ahead and put a diamond in there. For the shoulders, you're going to want strength, vitality, or all resist, cooldown, and area damage. For speed farming, if you can't roll one of those very easily, as you can see I kind of struggled to, I would recommend taking cooldown % instead of area damage. Okay, for the amulet, we're going to be using Squirt's Necklace. You want cold damage % instead of strength, but for all jewelry, you're also going to want that crit, socket. Alright, so for the gloves, I hope that you get better rolls than I do, but these are the correct stats that you're going to want. Attack speed, crit, and cooldown %. So for this build, we're going to be benefiting from the 3-piece Oghild bonus and the 6-piece Horde of the 90 Savage bonus. Depending on how tanky you feel, and you probably will feel pretty tanky with this build, you can either keep the vitality or drop it for damage against elites. But otherwise, strength, vitality, all resist, and 3 sockets with diamonds will do just fine. For the bracers, we will also be using Oghilds. I do recommend taking 20% cold damage, crit chance, and the life per hit should probably be dropped for strength. Because we hit so fast with this build, I did want to take life per hit just to kind of test it out, and I will say that it does work fairly well. So if you opt to go for the life per hit, I would definitely recommend getting one with strength instead of vitality. For the belt, we're going to be using the Undisputed Champion. This is essential for the build. We are going to want the strength, vitality, all resist, and frenzy damage. Make sure that you're going for the highest secondary roll that you can. I only have 342%. Ideally, you want to get as close to 400 as possible. I would say that it's probably worth taking lower primary stats to get a really nice secondary roll for this piece. Okay, so for the jewelry, we're going to be using the Convention of Elements as well as the Band of Might. I decided to roll with a non-ancient Convention of Elements because I got a 200% roll on my secondary stat. But for both of these pieces, you're ideally going to want average damage, crit, socket. If you can't get the average damage, strength will do just fine. You could also take cooldown or attack speed in this slot. For the legs, we are going to be using the Savages set. You're going to want to go with strength, vitality or all resistance, and frenzy damage. Moving on to the boots, we are going to be using the Savages set. These are going to be the stats that you want: strength, vitality, all resist, and armor. For our crafted primal, we're going to be going with the Oathkeeper. These are going to be the stats that I prefer to use: 10% damage, attack speed, and cooldown. With this build, I do recommend having at least 2 pieces with attack speed so you're up to 14%. Unless you happen to find a primal version of this with decent rolls, I would really suggest that you use your crafted primal in this slot. Getting a good roll on that secondary ability is really important. If you're able to find a primal version of an Oathkeeper, I would recommend using your crafted primal either on your belt or the Squirt's necklace. Moving on to our last piece, we're going to be using Ingeon. These are the stats that I recommend. I hope you roll them better than I did, but you're going to want to go with percent damage, damage against elites, and cooldown. You can also opt to go ahead and use attack speed here if you don't happen to get it to roll on your Oathkeeper. Just make sure that you're getting 14% regardless of how you do it. Okay, let's move into the cube. First off, we're going to be using Bastion's Revered. This allows Frenzy to stack up to 10 times and is essential for the build. We discussed earlier why this build kind of has a problem dealing with large groups of enemies, and it is because we're using this. Each additional hit will chain to enemies within 15 yards, and the damage is split between all of the affected enemies. Now for speedruns, this is pretty nice because you're going to be able to take down decent-sized crowds relatively quick, but for pushing, this can be a little problematic because if the crowd is large enough, your damage is just really not there, and you're not doing enough to take down the pack quickly. For our armor slot, we're going to go with Depth Diggers. We are using Frenzy, so this is just a 100% damage increase. And of course, we'll be using the Ring of Royal Grandeur because we are wearing 2 pieces of Oghilds and 5 pieces of Horde of the 90 Savages. Let's go ahead and dive into some pros and cons, as well as tips and tricks for playing this build optimally. This build actually has a lot of pros, at least in my opinion. And the first one would be that this build is really fun to play. It's very satisfying. You're moving really quickly and swinging really fast. It kind of reminds me of a Zealer Paladin from Diablo 2. Another pro is that this is absolutely a viable RGK. Not only that, but we had discussed earlier that we are going to be using Threatening Shout and Warcry, so you add a lot of support to your group for being an RGK. I will add that the RGK variant does play Ancient Spear as well, so you're also adding a bit of support in that regard by pulling enemies into the group. The next pro is something that actually surprised me. This build does okay for speedrunning GR 110 to 115, and I'm sure with better gear, it could get up to 120. I'll also add that on the PTR, my Paragon level is only 1359, and so when you get more Paragons to add on to that, you are absolutely going to be crushing and probably able to do speed 120s, if not even higher. Another pro is that on the current PTR, these Barbarians are able to clear 150s. There's actually more 150 clears with Horde of the 90 Savages than there are with Rakors. More people are probably testing this set, which probably influences that. I don't think many people are testing Rakors as compared to Horde of the 90 Savages, given its recent buff. If Blizzard takes the feedback from Rax and Woody, there is a chance that the potion effects that grant you a shrine or pylon will be nerfed, and I do think that that will absolutely hurt this build a bit for its GR 150 potential. It almost seems like every build on the PTR has some GR 150 potential. All you need to do is get lucky enough to roll Conduit 4 times in a row. Even if you get a power mixed in there, it's not really a big deal. So there is a lot of RNG right now that's involved in running higher grade rifts. Okay, let's go ahead and move into some of the cons for this speed build. The first one being that you really require good elite density. Because we're using the Ingeon, if we don't get enough elites, we aren't going to be able to constantly spam Furious Charge to get around and to freeze our enemies. That is both a substantial damage loss as well as a mobility and speed loss. The next con that I have listed is something that we've already discussed, so I won't go too far into detail, but of course, you are going to struggle with larger packs. The next con is kind of tied into that, where we have good AoE when we're speed farming, and when that damage is getting splitted, it's ruining enemies really quickly. But when you get up to those higher tiers, your AoE is a little bit lacking compared to some other builds. And the last con, and this one is huge for me, this build requires so much clicking. You're constantly spamming Frenzy, and I feel like anybody who has any physical problems, especially in their hand or wrist, may want to avoid this build, Personally, I have wrist problems, it kind of burns sometimes, and this build absolutely makes it act up. But if your hand and wrist are great, go ahead and play this build, it's an absolute blast. And lastly, let's just go ahead and dive into some gameplay tips and tricks. You are going to be wanting to elite hunt. We kind of mentioned this earlier, but your Wrath of the Berserker is incredibly reliant on the Ingeom going off. On top of that, you can spam Furious Charge endlessly when your Ingeom is procced. This build can have 100% uptime on Wrath of the Berserker as long as you're getting to enough elite packs. If you get a bad map and there are just not that many elites or they're spread out and far apart, you may struggle a little bit. Okay, for the next tip, just make sure that you're using Furious Charge on the enemies that you plan on attacking, especially on elites. You want to freeze them for 2.5 seconds to double your damage, and this also keeps you really safe and allows you to keep up the buff on your Squirt's Necklace. Another tip that I have for speedruns is that you should probably stop for high progress enemies. I will go ahead and leave a link down below in the description to Warpath so that you can identify which enemies are going to give you a lot of progress. This build just has great single target damage, and so I like to stop for these high progress enemies because we can take them down pretty quick on our way to the next elite pack. I almost forgot to cover legendary gems and the follower. So we're going to be using Bane of the Trapped, Simplicity Strength because we are using Frenzy, which is a primary skill, and lastly we'll be using Molten Wildebeest Gizzard. This is going to make us more tanky and keep the Squirt's Necklace buff up. Now for the follower. This one is a little hard to gear out because we're going to be using Hand of the Prophet to gain access to all skills. So because we're using this focus, you're going to want to make sure that your Enchantress is as tanky as possible. You'll want to ensure that you are getting at least 25,000 intelligence as well so that you can benefit from these abilities that are reliant on the Enchantress's intelligence. I will recommend the Guardian set because this is really going to make her tanky. You're going to get way more vitality and intelligence, which of course is going to give all resistance. So I'm not going to dive too deep into the priority stats, just make sure that you're focusing on survivability. You'll want to go with the Guardian's Helm, the Homing Pads, Flavor of Time, Nemesis Bracers, Oculus Ring, Ring of Royal Grandeur to make sure that you can benefit from the 3-piece Guardian set, the Guardian's Belt. Gloves of Worship are actually really great this season because when we use our potion, if we happen to get a shrine effect, it's going to last 10 minutes. I'm using Captain Crimson's legs here. Go ahead and use whatever you want. This was just an easy item for me to craft. And lastly, we're going to go with the Ice Climbers and the Pig Sticker. Let's go ahead and dive into some gameplay now. I'm going to show you one GR115 that I cleared in under 3 minutes just to kind of give you an idea of how the build works. Alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you for tuning in. Go ahead and drop a comment down below. Let me know if you're interested in playing the Horde of the 90 Savages in Season 28. If you're not interested, what classes are you going to be focused on? Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one.